My name is Frank Trommler. I'm a retired professor of the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm interviewing today Harry Carl Schaub, Honorary Consul General of the Republic of Austria in Philadelphia. The first question, most important, where did you grow up, Harry? And what made your youth sort of go into the direction of politics, law, and is this already in your youth? Is it already in your family?
I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in Lucerne County, went to school there, and some of my earliest recollections were reading in the newspaper as a young boy about Austria. And many of the people who were friends of mine and who were active in politics had a background in the then Austrian Empire. So Austria came early into my life. I'm proud to say I grew up in a town named Freeland. I was the black sheep who went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm glad I did. And that's where my career started. Class of 1946, and I decided my father, I was very fortunate parents. My father had two jobs. He ran a clothing manufacturing company, and he was also elected. He could do this legally. Was also elected, believe it or not, as Register of Wills of Lucerne County. And so in 1936, I helped campaign for the re-election of Franklin Roosevelt.
Tell me, this is some sort in the legal profession. When did you start thinking of studying law? Was it a pen? Is it the background?
I have to introduce another parent, my mother, who had a role, and she always respected lawyers, and she talked to me about it. Her principal activity was as a soprano, first soprano, in St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Freeland. So there was always music, good music, in our home.
Harry is a retired counsel of the law firm of Montgomery, McCracken. And it is interesting to follow Harry's career. Was there any bridge to law, or was it just an interest of you because you had heard about Austria earlier that you went over and wanted to do more?
I think I would answer that complicated question by saying that I had always an interest in politics and law, because there is a relationship. And I could go on from national law to international law, because the relationships in Europe and Asia, it was natural for me.
I'm just wondering, as an undergraduate in political science, certainly you are exposed to some extent to the political things of that time, around 1950. Did they recruit you already?
Yes. I remember I recognized very early, and before I was a teenager, that I had to do something to escape living in a small town in Eastern Pennsylvania. And many Pennsylvanians went through this process. So I was receptive to a career that would take me out of living in a small town of wonderful people, but it was different. And so I didn't even know that there was a reserve intelligence unit in the political science department. But I was well respected as a student. And Gary Tum, who was the instructor of me in the quiz section, said, Mr. Schaub, could you join me after class? He made this announcement. And that was not the best way to do it because of jealousies and so forth. But it happened, and he said, we're forming a reserve unit, and you have no military experience, so you are going, if you elect to join us, we will invite you, and you will enlist in the reserves. I was accepted and became a private, and then I graduated and started Yale Law School, and fortunately there was a Yale unit, so I transferred from the Penn unit to the Yale unit. And then a year later, maybe 1/4 of these intelligence units were called to active duty, and I went off to Washington. And we were in the Pentagon, and my expertise was then on Eastern Europe, and I became this I've never written about, became the Yugoslav desk officer. And I had...
Did you go to Yugoslavia?
In the Pentagon. I did not go to Yugoslavia until later.
So we will come to our second part about Austria and about your professional lifelong relations with Austria.
While I was adjusting to practicing law in Philadelphia, I was very active in the World Affairs Council, and actually was a senior officer in my early 30s, and that gave more and more exposure, and I started to meet people who were ambassadors or consul generals. And the word maybe got around the World Affairs Council that I was capable or able to as a lawyer, do things.
So in this case, did the state of Austria approach you? How is that done?
There was a growth in the number of honorary consuls. And because they decided, governments saved a lot of money by because normally our honorary consuls are not paid. You do it for the love of the game, as it were. And Austria had asked several former Austrians, and of course who would speak the language, but they turned it down because it was no money involved, and you were supposed to spend money from your office, and it helped better if you had an office and secretarial help. So I know two Austrians who I later found out had turned down the application. I told the Austrians that I come to Washington fairly often because I was doing Securities and Exchange Commission public offerings. I was then in touch with the deputy to the ambassador, and he said, well, come by. Well, I went by, did my SEC filing first, and then went to the embassy to meet the ambassador, and it went well. What? It went so well that I'd never officially heard the results until a contract appeared in the mail. In other words, I had the interview, it apparently went well, and they appointed me without telling me in advance.
But you have been very successful in the course of 30 years more. It is just interesting, as a historian, I look at the time between 1972 and 1999. There were ups and downs.
Indeed.
In the Austrian-American relations.
I was actually quite surprised. I was happy to have that kind of government to work for. It showed that I could get along with people. But Waldheim was a little too close to people.
When was it? Maybe you could say Kreisky was in the 70s and Waldheim is in the 80s.
The 80s. Well, it was not, with due respect, it was not a matter of dates, but it was attitudes. And I don't think Waldheim's attitude was appropriate.
Maybe since you are sort of high point, certainly is Kreisky with his very considerate politics for Austria, and Waldheim, who had been United Nations Secretary and then became the President of Austria, despite the fact that certain things were discovered in the German Wehrmacht where he was part of it. So it is ups and downs, high and low. For you, being in contact with Austrian ministries, I assume most important was the foreign ministry in Vienna. However, also the question is you as an honorary consul of Austria in a big American city with quite an outreach, have you been sort of counseled much by the Austrian state? Was there certain lines of conduct or of thinking that you would bring into the American public when you gave a speech?
No, I was Honorary Consul General.
You were Honorary Consul General?
General, yes.
That means, tell us about the difference.
Well, the difference is the pay. No.
No. Yeah.
It's not a difference.
It's status.
Yes,
status.
yes.
Looking back at this, where consulate services are scaled back. The European Union has its representatives in the country and so on. What is your impression now? Are honorary consul generals or consuls used that the way that they were used in the late 20th century? Are they necessary? Are they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the more contact there is with the representatives, the more chance there is to evade more serious problems that could be developed, more opportunity to negotiate solutions.
What do you negotiate?
Well, a wide variety of different problems dealing with will there be peace and peaceful solutions rather than the other solution.
Let me be more specific in the question, because consulate services are known to do economic business relations and propagate their country. There's also for Austria a particular issue that is culture. Austria thinks it is a Weltkulturmacht, not just it's a cultural entity of great renown with music, with a lot of cultural products.
A cultural superpower.
That's
the
it.
Austrians think
Yes.
they are a cultural superpower. And I encourage that.
Go ahead.
I did, because I think that people who have such a reputation are not likely to go off the deep end. They have too much at stake to lose their good relations.
Harry, we talked about Kreisky and Waldheim, who had been the Secretary of the United Nations, a big, well-regarded diplomat from Austria. And in the late 80s, when the scandal about his involvement in the Wehrmacht became known and was a sort of world sensation, you were here in Philadelphia, and at times you might have encountered people who ask about Waldheim. What do you think? How is your reaction to this affair?
That it was an unfortunate period of service with the Wehrmacht, that I decided I would not try to defend his service, but that his service was in an area that he did not, the odds were he did not commit any war crimes. I would use that as a possible defense, but he seemed so, and I know he was well advised by friends of mine, and he still was not clever enough, and he wanted to be absolved, but there was no mechanism to absolve him completely.
Maybe you correct me that since Austria is a small country, and it was on the world stage with Waldheim, all of a sudden the small country had to defend its reputation in particular. How did this work for you, or how did you work with this?
I kept my own views.
Yes.
And I was receptive to the democratic process in Austria, and felt that unfortunate incidents such as the one we're dealing with here, the election of the president, it was unfortunate that he was the candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, since it is a small country, your attitude is strongly defensive and strongly diplomatic. And in some ways, when you're in Philadelphia confronting a group, some Jewish, some non, all of a sudden upset about Waldheim. So at this moment, you had to be very diplomatic, because
Yes.
you didn't want to trounce Austria, and
That's
you
right.
didn't want to be untrue to what happened.
Thank you.
We come to our third area of our interview. It is something that has impressed me as a professor of German culture and history at the University of Pennsylvania, that there is this lawyer in Montgomery, McCracken, in the office in Philadelphia, who tells me all of a sudden, "Oh, I'm writing a book on Erwin Lahousen." And I said, "Who is Erwin Lahousen?" And all of a sudden, when Harry Schaub tells me what happened, what is interesting, what brought his interest into the study, I learned Erwin Lahousen was the highest officer in the German resistance. In this case, the highest officer who was not killed afterwards by the Gestapo. So he could give testimony in Nuremberg about the resistance and about Hitler. that is more or less the interest that all of a sudden I found it very intriguing what you were doing. We had a meeting, we talked about it, we were in the Union League, I remember when you told me, and I was impressed by all these archival research, by a lot of stuff. How did you, as a lawyer, engage? How did you get the time? And you actually brought the book to completion. It's an English version, it's a German version, and it is a big success.
I have always been interested in the resistance against the Nazis inside Germany. It was not an easy fight because the Gestapo had friends everywhere. But Wolfgang Meyer, who's a lawyer in Vienna, and a friend of mine, knew and knows he's still kicking the story of Erwin Lahousen in some detail, and introduced me to Mrs. Lahousen and other members of the family. So that opened the door.
But then there is a step to going into archives.
Yes.
Writing it down, not
Writing
having a
it
writer's block.
Right. And it took, it took more than 5 years.
A consul is not just doing diplomatic work. It's not just representative. It's not just throwing parties.
Right.
But writing about a major figure of the Austrian army who then was taken over by the German Wehrmacht and rose to this occasion. The book is very lively written, and it starts out with Lahousen being interviewed as the first witness in Nuremberg. To the surprise of journalists, they said, "Who is he?" Because he was really, you have to be in the Abwehr, meaning in intelligence, you cannot be in front. So many people didn't know about him. And what you have on Earth is a lot of material about the Abwehr, about the intelligence, about the Holocaust, about things that went on. What did Catherine say, your wife?
Yeah.
She you were always in Vienna and doing stuff, I assume.
Yes. And very understanding and supportive. So,
but you were already stepping further to Strauss-Hupé.
Yes.
And it's a new article. It's this one that you pointed out, and in the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, an article on Robert Strauss-Hupé, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
Did you know him?
Yes, I saw him when I came to Penn. But if you asked me about this, then I would have to respond. He was the epitome of Cold Warrior. I read your article, and Harry Schaub makes a special case for European emigre being in the United States after World War II, already in World War II, but later, and advising the American government on communism, more or less. And Strauss-Hupé became one of those advisors. And the one thing you have to, since you had him in class, I mean, at Penn, and at that time he was still sort of advocate of American-European interests, but then he jumped to Asia and then to Vietnam and all this. Can you say something about that?
He wrote one autobiographical book. And in that book, he visited as a representative of the American government. He of all things, got to the point where the Chinese group around Chiang Kai-shek told him that with 1 or 2 This is written. This is one or two American divisions. And Chiang Kai-shek could win the war. Thank God we didn't do that.
Yeah, but was he part of it?
What?
Did he advise?
Oh, later, sure. Yeah. So, and no, we did not intervene ever in the Chinese Civil War.
But it is interesting how far Charles Huppé has advised.
Well, okay, he wrote this up, and the article I wrote originally covers only his service in military intelligence. And he jumped ship on me. When we were called to active duty on June 1, 1951, guess what? He didn't go because he hated Washington. And therefore he jumped ship. And he was substituted for by Dick Gordon, who was the treasurer of the University of Pennsylvania. Had to leave, went on active duty. And so that's part of the story.
And where did he go, Charles Huppé?
Well, he went and formed that publishing company. Yeah, he stayed on, and because he couldn't stand Washington. And we
So he wrote and advised, but at some point, if he became again important and influential?
He became more influential. Had he gone on active duty, he would have, like the rest of us, commuted to the Pentagon.
That makes sense, yes.
Yeah, he didn't do it. He got out.
He has founded the Foreign Policy
FPRI,
Research Institute in Philadelphia. What is behind this? Was it part of this sort of establishing his own empire?
Later,
Yeah.
that's what he did.
So when you look back at these years at his student, or 3 semesters, and want to summarize for people who have not known Charles Huppé, what would you say?
His service in World War II and the following Cold War, he pointed out the dangers of world communism.
Yes.
The trouble was he kept misjudging who the enemies were.
Okay, good. That's, I think, a valid, good point. And makes there are others like him, and it is not unique. Thank you, Harry. I think it was a great. You mentioned your age. It's 90, but you have some years to go, and we hope you will publish the book.
All right.
Good.
And you will criticize me if I don't tell the truth.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Good ending.
Thank you.
Good.